Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the special late night edition on Oz Arab Media. We are joined today by David Keyes, who's actually joining us in morning time from London. He is a well known historian and journalist who has done work with lots of British and international newspapers. He's just recently published a podcast, History Behind the Lines, focusing on the Gaza War, which can be found on Spotify. He's joined us today to discuss the current conflict and what it means for the greater world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ozari Media, and I'd like to welcome our guest, Mr. David Keyes. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks very much for inviting me on.
Well, thanks for joining us. So, in your first podcast, you mentioned how peace sentiment has weakened recently, but you also mentioned that it doesn't seem like there's a possible end in sight for this current conflict. Can the weakening of peace sentiment can be associated with, in fact, a possible end to the war, seeing that both sides are now more motivated than ever to claim victory?
Oh, sadly, I think that victory by either side really is unlikely to bring peace, or at least not a sustainable peace. I think there's only really the only possibility is a political solution. Victory by the current Israeli government will mean a continuation of oppression and injustice, and therefore a renewed conflict at some stage, almost inevitably, I would have thought. And any form of even partial victory by Hamas will simply mean that Israel will at some stage want to resume hostilities. So I think that, a victory by one side or the other is not likely to lead to a sustainable peace. I think there's got to be a genuine wish by both sides for a long-term peace. And only then, I think, we'll find a solution.
Well, as a historian, how vital has the history of the conflict been? Because obviously, this did not start in early October. This has been going on for more years than both of us have been alive combined. How has the inability, I should say, of successive generations to forget the traumas of the past contributed so much to the severity of this current war?
Well, I think that all people everywhere in every country are conditioned, if you like, psychologically, politically, culturally, in many other ways, by the shadow of history. So obviously, from a Palestinian perspective, the Palestinians lost their homes in 1948 and have been treated pretty appallingly in the West Bank and Gaza over recent decades. It's an appalling experience for the Palestinian people. And at the same time, obviously, the Israelis had the experience of the Holocaust and were themselves refugees. So what you've got is two peoples who have been forced into exile. The Jews a long time ago, but nevertheless experienced terrible things over many hundreds, indeed, probably over 1,000 years, and then you've got the Palestinians who also been forced into exile more recently, less than 100 years ago. And obviously, they have also experienced terrible things. So the burden of history, the shadow of history, I think, sits heavily on both peoples and conditions their attitudes, their views, etc. So I think that that's the importance of studying history, because it enables one to try to take a more objective view, rather than human beings being victims of history and conditioned by history. one can begin to try and analyze history and change history. And I think that's probably one of the ways forward.
Let's say from 1948 onwards, the history between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's well known how many horrible events have happened throughout the time. For example, right now, what's coming to my mind right now is the 1972 massacres at the Munich Olympics. That's still fresh on lots of people's minds. As long as this history is there, do you think peace at any time in the near future is possible between the two sides?
I think that the current war has probably reduced the possibilities of there being peace. I think it has weakened it. It's certainly weakened the peace camp in Israel. I'm sure that both sides will want peace, but the problem is that I think that both sides probably want a different type of peace. The Israelis want, the right-wing Israelis want to rule the whole area from the river to the sea, or from the sea to the river, and some parts of Palestinian society likewise. But they have a different vision as to what sort of state that would be. The right-wing Israelis want to have one under Israeli control, and obviously the Palestinians would like to see that under Palestinian control. And so I think that there are different visions. On the left, or on the left and the center in Israel, I think their position has been massively weakened because obviously the current the attacks on October the 7th massively pushed people on the left, or on parts of the left in Israel, towards the center and the right. So I think that probably the prospect of real, durable, long-term peace is quite a long way away. Partly, of course, because the Palestinian Authority, which are the sort of moderates in all this, have been so marginalized. They've been pushed aside, both by the Israeli right and indeed by Hamas.
In your podcast, you talk about a lot of things about leading up to the October 7 attacks and what happened afterwards, which, generally speaking, politicians around the world and media accepted as fact. But you revealed in your podcast this isn't so much the case. For example, I'd like you to start by mentioning how the Palestinians were essentially, that the October 7 attacks, I should say, showed division between the Palestinians, as this was not essentially a unanimous agreed attack.
Yeah, I think obviously the attack itself, the massacres of October the 7th, Hamas, like so many organizations all over the world, in Israel, in the West, everywhere in the world, even in China and Russia and other places, okay, political movements are not monolithic. They have normally quite big ranges of opinion within them. And of course, Hamas was no different to that. And so there was, I think, a lot of dissatisfaction in the military wing of Hamas with the direction which the political wing had been pursuing. In other words, the political wing wanted really to come into line with Fatah and try and move towards some sort of accommodation with Israel, two-state solution, the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And I think that was not popular with many on the military wing. So I think that led to a split, and indeed most people on the political wing of Hamas were completely unaware that these massacres were about to take place. In fact, they only found out about it. Most of the political wing only found out about it when they were underway, and so the Hamas's military wing's action in carrying out the massacres, the attacks, were had the effect of basically sidelining the political wing. Indeed, you could view it as a sort of almost a military coup d'etat in a sense. It sidelined the political wing. It also massively sidelined Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. It completely played into the hands of the Israeli right, who then launched a massive and ferocious attack, obviously, on Gaza. Massive overreaction, but Hamas's attack did play into the Israeli right's hands. And in fact, I suspect that it may have been intended to, because Hamas had said, senior Hamas person had said only 3 months before that Hamas was preparing for a major regional war. And really, there's only one way could they have got such a regional war. And that would have been to massively provoke Israel and play into the hands of the right and get Israel to massively overreact, and thus perhaps draw in Iran and others. And I think perhaps some within Hamas saw that as a way forward to weaken Israel in a way that people in Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and even on the political wing of Hamas did not see it. So major differences of perspective, I think, and encouraged by external players like Iran, like Russia, etc., for their own purposes.
It's somewhat ironic that certain Palestinian groups were completely unaware that these attacks were going to happen until they were underway, but Israeli intelligence had knowledge of these attacks beforehand.
Yeah, not only Israeli intelligence, but Egyptian intelligence, I think, as well. Indeed, I think the Egyptians warned the Israelis. Junior Israeli intelligence officers picked it up and warned their superiors. And indeed, I think Hamas's deputy leader, in fact, then deputy leader, actually made an announcement in Beirut that they were preparing for a major regional war. That was back in August that they made that announcement. So there was plenty of intelligence information available to the Israelis to ensure that they would know what was about to happen. But I think that probably hubris on the Israelis' part was probably the reason they decided to ignore these warnings. I think that they just didn't believe it was possible. They underestimated Hamas's capacity, and they just simply didn't believe it. I think that, lots of military organizations around the world and some politicians around the world, they tend to be experts when it comes to hubris, especially when they have a lot of power.
Okay. In your opinion, what would be the most ideal solution for this conflict? What is the best way in your mind that this conflict can be resolved? Maybe either just this current war or the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if it can bring a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the two-state solution is the only one. I carried out actually quite a detailed study looking at one-state experiments, and just to see whether there was any history in the world of one-state experiments actually working. And I have to say they're far and few between. The North Sudan, South Sudan one didn't work. The North Cyprus, South Cyprus one didn't work. The East and West Pakistan one-state solution didn't work. And in each case, these one-state experiments resulted in long-term further wars, huge, actually in total millions and millions of dead, and ended up with two states. So I think to imagine that a one-state solution of some sort would work with Israel and Palestine is cloud cuckoo land, and I think the lessons of history would show that it wouldn't work. I mean, it would be wonderful if it could, if one could have the United Republic of Israel and Palestine. How wonderful that would be. But I don't think it's feasible, and I think it could only end in tears. So I think one's got to probably settle for both sides have got to settle for a compromise, which is a two-state solution.
How would the two-state solution look in reality, as in a map? For example, Jerusalem will be a huge stickler point. It will be very difficult to divide Jerusalem in a way that satisfies both sides. So how would a two-state solution look on a map, and could Hamas play a role in it after the October 7 attacks?
I mean, I think that Jerusalem certainly should be the capital of any Palestinian state, and it should also be the capital of Israel as well. I don't see any reason why East Jerusalem can't be the capital of the Palestinian state, and West Jerusalem could be the capital of Israel. And ultimately they could have some sort of shared municipality or something, or some municipal services could be shared, etc. So I don't actually think that it's an impossibility. I think it's perfectly feasible, given goodwill. And I think that in terms of the West Bank and the settlements, people imagine that the settlements are a total obstacle to a two-state solution. I don't actually take that view. I think that obviously the settlement shouldn't be there. They are all illegal, but nevertheless they are now there. Fortunately, although the settlements are spread throughout the West Bank, if one looks at the large ones, the ones with the vast majority of the settler population actually lives within, I think, 5 or 10 miles of the Green Line. And so I think that probably mutually agreed land swaps would probably mean that a lot of the settlements could stay. Israel would lose some pretty good land elsewhere, which would be to the state of Palestine's gain. And I think that again, with goodwill, there are solutions that can be found, but that's because most of the vast majority of the settlers, I think it's 70 or 75% or something, actually live very near to the Green Line and not scattered all over the place. The settlements that are scattered all over the place tend to be smaller ones. So I do think that it is soluble, again, given goodwill. I also think that it's quite possible to have some sort of sovereign territory link between Gaza and the West Bank, either a bridge or a tunnel or a series of bridges and tunnels or whatever. I think, again, with goodwill, that's that's doable. Probably a bridge, I suspect, or a series of bridges, or a road with some bridges. So that would allow Israel to remain in one piece, and Palestine also to remain in one piece, with a connection between Gaza and the West Bank. So again, with goodwill, I think that it is possible to do it. The problem is, of course, that the current war has so massively undermined trust on both sides. I mean, the Hamas attack massively undermined trust amongst the Israeli left. I mean, I know the right was in power, but they probably won't always be in power. And the Israel, certainly it undermined trust on the Israeli left, and the Israel's massively disproportionate reaction and unnecessary reaction to the Hamas attacks. There were other ways that Israel could have dealt with the situation. That, the fact that probably between 30,000 and 45,000 people have been killed in Gaza, obviously that has massively undermined Palestinian trust in the Israelis, and has engendered huge amounts of additional hatred. So the war in both directions have not helped the prospects of peace, but one day there will have to be peace. And I think that, it is feasible, but probably not in the immediate future.
The Egyptians have been preparing the Sinai for a huge influx in Palestinian refugees. What do you think about that? Do you think, in your mind, there will be a huge rush of Palestinian refugees, and how many in number, how many Palestinian refugees in total could we expect fleeing to the Sinai?
To go into Sinai?
Yes.
Well, the Egyptians, of course, are not very happy about admitting anybody. I think they may find that they're forced to at some stage, but but they're not. They don't seem very happy to do so for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think my own feeling is that there should be an immediate ceasefire, an immediate permanent ceasefire. Both Israel and Hamas must come to a realization, respectively, that neither of them can have total victory, and that there should be an immediate ceasefire. I then think that the United Nations should pump in huge amounts of, and the international community, huge amounts of investment, facilities, etc., hospital ships, everything into the Gaza area, so that people can actually begin to rebuild their lives with the help of the international community. I think that is doable. And then I think that the work has got to be started to rebuild Gaza. I think that the idea that Gaza would remain a ruin forever would be preposterous. I'm sure that there are people on the Israeli right who might like that, but I think that it's unacceptable. There should be an immediate ceasefire and an immediate international plan to help the people of Gaza. If people are eventually allowed into Egypt, there's got to be a complete understanding that internationally guaranteed by the Americans, by the EU, by the Israelis, by everybody, that those Palestinians will be allowed back into Gaza. One can't really, I don't think it'd be tolerable to see yet another Nakba. I think absolutely outrageous idea.
I concur with that. The Israelis had a very for lack of a better word, fierce reaction to the October 7 attacks. You do mention the severity of the Israeli response to those attacks. Do you think there was an alternative way that Israel could have responded, either more diplomatically or less severe in their attacks? What would you say?
I mean, obviously, every country has an inherent right to self-defense under those sort of circumstances. I think that, however, there's a difference between an overreaction and a reasonable self-defense measures. I think that what Israel has done has not been a reasonable reaction. I think it's been a massive overreaction. I think that's been motivated by a whole load of factors within Israel. And I, you know, it's been an absolute catastrophe what has happened in Gaza. But I do think that Israel could have taken another route. I think that from Israel's point of view, their main aim should have been to make sure this didn't happen again, and that would have meant, without doubt, beefing up the border area so that there were proper defences. I mean, all there was really was a relatively flimsy fence. I mean, a big metal fence, but it was, as we know, it was a few bulldozers and I think a bit of dynamite was all that was needed to dispose of sections of it, and that's how Hamas managed to carry out their invasion. I think that again it was hubris on the part of Israel that it hadn't taken proper defensive measures, that it hadn't got proper border security in place. I think that they never occurred to them that Hamas might use, drones to get rid of the cameras, etc., etc. And I think that was just sort of hubris and incompetence on the part of the Israelis. So I think the lesson of what happened was that they could have, instead of invading the whole of Gaza and bombing the whole of Gaza, they should have immediately beefed up the border defenses. And if they really wanted to do it belt and braces, they could have then taken over perhaps the southern half mile of Gaza to make sure that they had control of the border with Egypt or with the southern part of the Mediterranean coast, maybe a 3 or 4 mile stretch of that coast. That would have paid to a lot of the smuggling of weapons, etc., etc. And it would not have necessitated the bombing of Gaza, would not have necessitated any of that on the scale that's occurred. And one wouldn't now have between 30,000 and 40,000 dead. And one wouldn't have the degree of hatred that has been induced, and also Israel would not be a pariah state, which it's quickly becoming. So I think that from everybody's point of view, a slightly more calibrated response would have been essential. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that the Americans tried to push Israel in a less aggressive direction and failed. I don't think the Israelis were in a mood, certainly the Israeli right were not in a mood to listen to anybody, sadly. And the world and the Palestinians and indeed the Israelis are paying a price for that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Israel is becoming a pariah state. Obviously, since this current war started on the 7th of October and the actions of the Israelis, it's given them more scrutiny than it ever has in the past. And I think that's most notably seen in South Africa's case against the Israelis, What do you think of that? Do you think this could be a possible beginning of a global trend of nations starting to think more neutrally when it comes to this conflict, not either being so pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, but seeing what's being done and trying to come to a fair solution for both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only solution, as I was saying, is is some sort of compromise, and that is the two-state solution. But in order to achieve that, I think that states have got to behave themselves on the basis of a rule-based order. And unfortunately, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now the total overreaction and mass slaughter in Gaza, I think that the world has thrown the rule-based order, international rule-based order, into the waste bin to an extent, and that's extremely dangerous. So I think that it's important that people look at the rules that guarantee justice or that purport to guarantee justice, and that they uphold them. And I think that what has happened with the West telling the Russians that they mustn't, quite rightly telling the Russians that they're very naughty to, that they should not have invaded Ukraine, etc., etc. And I think the West, the world is quite right to do that. But by the same token, not upholding the rules in Israel-Palestine has made the West look very hypocritical in that respect, and I think that poses a big danger. So yeah.
Do you think this could be a possible precursor to World War III? Obviously, the existence of nuclear weapons hinders any. I won't say it lessens any possibility of that happening, but considering the severity of the war and the passionate reactions from all sides, could this be a possibility that can lead to a third world war?
I think that on balance of probabilities, it probably won't lead to a third world war. Well, at least I hope it won't, as we all hope it won't.
Definitely
but,
not.
but on the other hand, if we look at let's say the Second World War, there are disturbing similarities between the two. Basically, people often think of the Second World War as being, starting in 1939 with
Invasion of Poland.
the German invasion of Poland, etc., etc. That's probably an incorrect way of looking at it, because basically what was happening was that there was a whole series of regional conflicts that were happening. The Japanese in East Asia, doing things in East Asia, the Italians invading Ethiopia, the Germans assisting the fascists in Spain to seize power, the Germans taking over Austria, etc., etc. And there were a whole series of other sort of regional wars going on. And the Second World War is really when all those regional wars link up. And they fully link up, of course, in 1941, 42. But I hope that is not going to happen in this case. But certainly, we have seen a big increase over the last few years of conflicts around the world, and the more conflicts that occur, the easier it is for countries to start new ones. So, the more conflicts there are, the less resources major countries have to deal with them all, and the more countries feel that, oh well, there's a punch up going on here, there, and everywhere. We'll launch our own. So I think that, for instance, the current situation in Ukraine and the Middle East probably increased the chances that at some stage in the not too distant future, China will massively turn on the heat on Taiwan, and that could easily lead to conflict in East Asia, and indeed Southeast Asia with the the Chinese and the Filipinos have recently had clashes in the South China Sea. So wars tend to lead to wars, and that's what happened really in the run-up to World War II. We are seeing the same pattern. I hope it doesn't have the same consequences. I think that for the sake of justice and for the sake of peace and international security, the international community needs to invest more in finding solutions to disagreements such as Israel-Palestine and indeed Russia-Ukraine.
David, you're obviously a expert on this subject. We could be sitting here for hours discussing it. It has been nearly 40 minutes now. You've given a great deal of information. So on behalf of Oz Arab Media and our viewers, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. If you could just mention to our audience as well where they can find your podcast and the name of it if they would like to learn a little bit more.
Sure. My podcasts are on Spotify, History Behind the Headlines. But if people want to sort of have a shortcut to it, if they just look up my website, okay, I have two websites, in fact. One website is a page at the Independent newspaper in London, but that's mainly sort of archaeology and history articles. But then I have my own website. Just look up David Keys, and people will come across it on Google, and that's Keys, David Keys. And then if they look at the top bar, they'll see podcasts, and if they go there, they'll see that the 6 podcasts. Well, there'll be more than 6 there. There's a load of other ones as well, but a series of 6 on Gaza, and they cover everything from the long-term background, going all the way back to Babylonian and Roman times, all the way through to the current terrible conflict in Gaza, Israel's war on Gaza, and going forward, looking at the long-term potential political implications of it all. There's about the six podcasts in the Gaza War series, and people will be able to access those. Just look up the easiest way, probably look up my name, David Keys, my website, and have a look at that.
All right.
And, under podcasts at the top bar.
Thank you, David, so much for joining us. And thank you to our viewers. And as David just told us, if you'd like to learn more, you can find his podcast there. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.